Hello, good evening and welcome to Biz First in Focus. We have a very special guest joining us in the studio this evening. He is the new trade envoy of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Theresa May, to Sri Lanka. His name is Ranil Jayawardena. He is the Conservative Member of Parliament for North East Hampshire. Mr. Jayawardena, thank you very much for taking time off your schedule during your short trip to Sri Lanka to actually join us and talk about your role and what it is that you hope to accomplish. Let me start by asking you this: the trade envoy to Sri Lanka, the Prime Minister's trade envoy. What exactly does this role entail?
Well, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, has been very clear that she wants Britain to be a beacon of trade in the world, and indeed freer trade in the world. As we leave the European Union, there is a huge potential for Britain to trade with partners, including Sri Lanka. And the Prime Minister's Trade Envoy programme is designed to make sure that we're building closer links with our friends around the world, including Sri Lanka. Given my personal connection to Sri Lanka, I'm delighted to have been appointed, and in the very short time that I have been here, it's immediately apparent to me that there are great opportunities for Britain and Sri Lanka to trade more with one another in the months, years, decades ahead. The opportunities are in so many different sectors, and so it's important that I focus my time on those sectors where there is the biggest opportunity for Britain and Sri Lanka to trade with one another, and that's what I hope to be able to do in the months ahead. I've already begun that with a programme of meetings with government here as well as businesses here, and that plays to the question you asked, which is the role is both across business and government in the UK and in Sri Lanka to facilitate those connections.
You mentioned the Prime Minister wanting to see a bigger focus on freer trade around the world as Britain leaves the European Union. Brexit was a major topic here in Sri Lanka as well. How does Britain leaving the European Union really impact Sri Lankan? Does it have any impact on Sri Lanka's relations with the UK?
Well, Sri Lanka and the UK have a relationship going back well before the European Union was even created. So I think it's important that we look at that long history and the sense of friendship that it continues to exist between Britain and Sri Lanka. The trading relations existed before the European Union came into being. They will continue when we are no longer part of the European Union. And while we have always been a strong advocate for Sri Lanka in the European Union, including helping Sri Lanka win back GSP Plus status within the EU, we are very mindful that a lot of Sri Lanka's trade is with the UK, and so it's very important that we continue to have a positive relationship. We've in fact just been legislating in the UK Parliament. I've been looking at this very closely as a member of the Trade Committee in Parliament to make sure that we're able to roll over existing trading arrangements, including with countries like Sri Lanka. So in terms of our ability to trade with one another, the ongoing relationship will continue, and I very much hope that it will be possible to deepen relationships as we go forward.
You mentioned rolling over existing agreements. Does this also extend to GSP Plus?
So we will have our own arrangements that will be comparable to the arrangements the EU has. We will be in control of our own ability to set who should get what and what that should be. And it will also mean that in the future we'll have the opportunity to deepen ties in a number of different ways, not just in terms of trading arrangements, but also in terms of non-tariff barriers, regulatory regimes and so on, where we can become closer and we can remove some of the barriers that stop business being able to trade internationally.
When you speak of removing barriers, you've had meetings over the past couple of days with government leaders, with members of the business community here in Sri Lanka, you mentioned. What was the sense that you got from these meetings in openness to trade to embracing trade?
Well, I think there's a really positive direction of travel here in Sri Lanka with the negotiation of free trade agreements by the Sri Lankan government with Singapore, negotiations ongoing in India and China. So there's a real positivity that Sri Lanka is open for business, wants to trade, and of course trade is the route to the prosperity of the people. Better jobs, lower prices, more choice and improved quality of life. And so it's really positive that that's been happening, and there's always more to be done. There are challenges also. Speaking to some of the business community, there are challenges that the Sri Lankan government recognises are there, and they're working on. The economic reforms that the government has introduced over the last few years, I very much hope will be continued. There's more to be done. The Sri Lankan government has made it clear that they know there's more to be done in order to improve the lives of people across the island. Improve the opportunities that people have here, and that's in a number of different ways. So it's not just all about the trade policy and the plans, the vision for trade. It's around also a lot of domestic policy, including, for example, education, giving people the right skills from which they can work for the businesses and then trade with the world.
Very quickly, before we go in for a short break, do you envision a free trade bilateral agreement between the UK and Sri Lanka becoming a reality anytime in the future?
Well, right now, you've referenced Brexit. We are leaving the European Union, and so we must make sure, for the sake of Sri Lankan businesses and many others, that we have a positive relationship with the EU. We certainly don't want to fetter our ability to have positive, deepened relationships with countries around the world. The Prime Minister's made it very clear that she wants to make sure that we do have the ability to agree our own free trade agreements. But right now, we're focused on rolling over the existing deals, which makes sure that Sri Lanka has excellent access to our market under the comparable GSP+.
And on that note, we're going for a short commercial break. When we come back, we'll look at the challenges facing bilateral trade between the UK and Sri Lanka. Welcome back to Biz First in Focus. We're in conversation with the Prime Minister of the UK's new trade envoy to Sri Lanka, the Honourable Ranil Jayawardena MP, Conservative Member of Parliament for North East Hampshire. Mr. Jayawardena, I'd like to bring your attention to the challenges that are facing trade, not just in Sri Lanka, but around the world. We've seen a growing wave of anti-trade sentiment. We saw this with the United States pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And here in Sri Lanka too, there's been stiff opposition. You mentioned the bilateral trade agreements. We have signed one with Singapore, but there's been stiff opposition to trade agreements with China and India. In this sort of environment, how difficult does this make your job?
Well, you've dealt with the global trend, and so it's important to look at it in that context. We must, I believe, remake the arguments for freer trade. It goes back centuries that freer trade delivers prosperity to the people in a country. Protectionism only holds countries, businesses and people back. In fact, protectionism looks after the few, not the many. And I really believe that there is an argument to be made to say that free trade is in the interests of everyone. If we look at the international context around the US and TPP, actually it's interesting to see that a lot of businesses in the US are very keen for the US to think again about that. Indeed, it could be said that America First is actually about making sure that America has opportunities to trade more, because that will deliver more jobs, better wages, and indeed lower prices to American people. And that's true everywhere. TPP, of course, is something that has the opportunity to transform the Pacific Rim. It has the opportunity to also ensure that there are harmonized standards, which is good for consumers. And in terms of the trade agreements here in Sri Lanka, I think there is an argument to be made. An argument. Of course, it's possible for people to argue on both sides, but I think there is an argument to be made that if Sri Lanka wants to play in the international community, grow its economy, secure more foreign investment, then it needs to make sure it's open to that. And here's the thing. Trade is a two-way street. It requires investment in, It requires export out. It requires products being bought in. It requires investment out. So it requires there to be a really free and open movement of goods and capital. And I think it's critical, absolutely critical, that Britain makes that case in the world. And that's why I'm so pleased the Prime Minister, Theresa May, has set out her agenda for freer trade being a force for good.
Talking about domestic challenges in Sri Lanka, we touched on this briefly previously. You mentioned how there is a need for, or rather, I'm telling you how there appears, how businesses in Sri Lanka have been calling, specifically those involved in exports, have been calling for streamlining processes, customs processes, lifting tariffs on raw materials that they need to manufacture their goods, etc. When you, from the outside looking in, does Sri Lanka appear to you as a more protectionist or more free trade country?
Well, it's a country that's moving in the right direction, and I think all countries have barriers to trade today that could be reduced. And you know, the UK, of course, has a barrier to trade in respect of the European Union being a tariff barrier around the whole of the EU that we're not in control of today, but we will be in control of as we leave the EU. And in terms of Sri Lanka, the para tariffs only found here in Sri Lanka are something that do need to be looked at. Some of the customs arrangements, on the other hand, have been improved with the single window to customs. I think it's a really important step in the right direction. So there's always a case that there's more to be done. There's always a case that with the right support, the right environment, business can create more good jobs. They can improve the quality of lives of people that are able to work for them, and indeed the products that they produce can also be of great benefit. You know, in terms of British businesses doing more here, there needs to be the opportunity for British businesses to find the places to invest, have confidence that the system isn't going to oscillate all the time, and there's going to be a clear set of pro-business policies that allow businesses internationally to invest, knowing that they can be here for the long run. You know, Britain has some companies that this was set up by British people hundreds of years ago that are still running today under Sri Lankan management. It shows that there's a great connection between Britain and Sri Lanka, and we should capitalise on that. We've got the opportunity to bring more businesses here, global brands, that will really set Sri Lanka apart from other countries in the region.
You mentioned the need for policy consistency in Sri Lanka, and this is something that has been echoed by Sri Lanka's international partners, East and West, and even by the Sri Lankan business community. What is it that you would like to see considered or attention focused on when trade policy is being drafted?
Well, look, it's not for me to set out what Sri Lankan trade policy should be. That's a matter for the Sri Lankan government. But what I will say is that the economic reform agenda that there has been is clearly moving in the right direction. The liberalisation of markets, the opportunity for more choice, the ability for people to compete, and indeed the procurement process that's now been improved by the government in terms of a government procurement portal. These are the sorts of things that need to happen if Sri Lanka is able to and wants to attract that investment. It also means that the government should continue to have a long-term vision. I visited in January Port City, and I met with representative Port City again on this visit, and it's really encouraging to see a project that is looking out to what, 2035, 2040, once it's fully complete. A policy like that demonstrates long-term vision, and allied to that needs to be the government support for businesses that might want to invest now in order that they know that it will only come good in a couple of decades' time. Global brands want to have some certainty. The way that the Port City in particular will be run could well allow those global brands to invest here. So I'm really encouraged that Sri Lanka is moving in the right direction according to what businesses have told me, and I'm also very encouraged that government doesn't seem to be backing away from that.
You mentioned earlier on in the show that you've seen immense potential for the growth of bilateral relations between the UK and Sri Lanka, specifically in the areas of trade. In your brief interactions that you've had with businesses here in Sri Lanka and at home in the United Kingdom, have you identified any specific areas of cooperation?
Absolutely. In my very short visit this time in February, but also from conversations I had in January, there do seem to be a number of key areas, and perhaps I could just cover three. The first, I'd say, was infrastructure. There are some very bold plans to build more bridges, rural bridges, highway extensions and so on, but also wider social infrastructure like more hospitals and renovations of hospitals and schools. So that sort of infrastructure, I think, is absolutely critical to the success of the Sri Lankan economy, but also to improve the lives of Sri Lankan people. So if the Sri Lankan government is willing, there is the opportunity for British businesses to be able to deliver some of those projects and deliver them quickly at a fair and honest price to the highest quality, which will benefit Sri Lankan people across the island. Of course, it's all very well growing the economy, but if there's no energy and energy security, then the economy falls flat. And so it's also very good to know that energy is an important priority for the government here, and energy is certainly a priority also for me. I think there's the traditional fossil fuels, LNG, will be something that British business could do. There's the opportunity for British business to supply and also deliver infrastructure here in Sri Lanka, but also thinking to the future. It's important to look at the opportunity for renewable energies. Renewable energy is not only sustainable and environmentally friendly, but they're also totally secure to the island of Sri Lanka, not relying on any ships bringing fuel in. So there's real potential for British business to do that, and we're world leaders in wind turbines and in tidal power. Britain and Sri Lanka are both islands, of course, so it means we've got many things in common. And then a third area, I think, that's of absolute significance, great significance to the bilateral relationship is technology. And coming back to the FTAs that Sri Lanka's begun to negotiate, the opportunity for British businesses to transfer technology from the UK to Sri Lanka, to create jobs here in Sri Lanka, to create wealth for Sri Lanka and export from Sri Lanka to other regional markets.
Access other markets.
Exactly. I think that is the way in which everyone gets a win-win out of it. The jobs here, the British businesses are able to access new markets utilising the FTAs that Sri Lanka's negotiated. That technological transfer is the future, and I hope Sri Lanka is going to be part of it.
Quickly before we go into a break, a few years ago the former Prime Minister of the UK, David Cameron, hosted an anti-corruption summit in London, where the Sri Lankan President Maithripala Sirisena was also present. Pledges were made. In your role now as trade envoy to as the Prime Minister's trade envoy to Sri Lanka, how big of a deal is corruption, and do the levels of corruption in Sri Lanka concern you?
Well, look, Britain plays with a straight bat, so our British businesses are very strictly regulated. We have very tight laws on the way that we do business, and we will always continue to do that. The important thing is that the Sri Lankan government's continued to honour its commitments, and the President's made very clear statements here that he wants to continue that push to reduce corruption in the system wherever it's found to exist. And that's an important statement of intent. It's a matter for the Sri Lankan government to go and do that. All I will say is British businesses will always adhere to the highest standards and will obey UK law in the way that they operate in the UK and internationally.
Thank you very much. On that note, another break. When we come back, we'll look at Ranil Jayawardena, the man and the mission. Welcome back to the show. We're in conversation with Ranil Jayawardena. He's the new trade envoy of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to Sri Lanka. He's also a Conservative Member of Parliament for North East Hampshire. Mr. Jayawardena, I'd like to introduce you to the business community in Sri Lanka. So tell us a little bit about yourself. How did Ranil Jayawardena end up as the Conservative Member of Parliament for North East Hampshire?
Well, I mean, that's a very long story that could take a lot longer than the entire length of this programme, but I'll be very brief. You know, my father moved from Sri Lanka to the UK in the 1970s, and he set about becoming an accountant, as many people from Sri Lanka do. I understand Sri Lanka has the second highest number of chartered management accountants in the world after the UK. My father set out becoming an accountant, and he wanted to make sure that I was given the opportunities to succeed in whatever way I wanted to, and that first manifested itself in reading government at the LSE, and I met many great people, including some Sri Lankan students at the same time, and that furthered to me ending up in the City of London, working for Lloyds Bank, where I worked in capital markets and corporate banking. So I genuinely understand business. In fact, some of the businesses that are investing in the UK, once upon a time I was involved in banking them. So it's great to see that come full circle. But having my father's blood in me, public service has always been very important to my father's family, and indeed also to my mother's family. And so I've for a long time volunteered in the UK in local government. It's unpaid in the UK, and in my time in local government, I was able to achieve lots of things for my community. Economic regeneration has always been a priority of mine, whether it's supporting trade internationally or simply regenerating my local town. And from there, the opportunity arose to stand for Parliament. In 2013, the opportunity was given to me to be the Conservative Party candidate. Why am I Conservative? Because I believe in people, in families. I believe in the ability of communities to do things for themselves rather than for the state to always do things. And that's why I'm delighted to be a Conservative MP today.
So your inspiration to come into politics, would be right in saying your father?
Well, my father's always been very political, but he's never served in any political office, either here or in the UK. But certainly the opportunity to be political and to serve in public life was something that was never off the table for me. My father and my mother had always been very clear that I should do what I wanted to do, and though I was first in the city, it ended up being that actually the opportunity to represent my own community, the community I grew up in North East Hampshire, where I went to school, incidentally where my wife also grew up and went to school, and where our daughters live today. I mean, the opportunity to represent my home community is a great privilege, and the ability for me to now also additionally work with Sri Lanka is greatly humbling, and to see the number of people that follow me on Facebook from Sri Lanka is wonderful. So I very much hope that now I can further that relationship.
The Prime Minister has given you an opportunity, as you said, to sort of reinforce that bond with Sri Lanka now as her trade envoy to the island. What is your mission now?
Well, we've talked around it for the duration of this interview. The mission for me is to make sure that there are ever closer relations between Sri Lanka and the UK, drawing on that long heritage, that shared set of values, indeed a shared language. And through that, there can be prosperity for both peoples, the ability for British businesses and Sri Lankan businesses to create good jobs on both sides, the ability for people to benefit from those good jobs, improve their quality of life. That's got to be the way forward. And so that is my priority in politics, whether it's in the UK or here in Sri Lanka.
So the road is not going to be easy. There are going to be many obstacles on the way, especially when it comes to trade in Sri Lanka. There's always stiff opposition. How do you plan to overcome?
The argument must be made. The argument must be made that trade is the route to prosperity. If people want to live better lives in the years ahead, then they will have to work on improving trade relations with countries around the world. The only way that countries succeed is by looking outward, not looking inward. And so that's a matter for Sri Lankan politicians to make domestically. All I will do is support British business and in turn Sri Lankan businesses working with British businesses to make sure that they are doing whatever they can within the environment that they work in. And already today, we are Sri Lanka's third largest trading partner, so there's already a significant amount of work ongoing, much more to do.
Globally, world leaders are struggling with giving out the message that trade is the route to prosperity, greater wealth, higher incomes, lower prices, etc. What do you think needs to change in the messaging, in how this message is communicated?
Well, I'd look to, naturally, you might expect me to say this, I'd look to what our Prime Minister, the UK Prime Minister, has been saying. You know, she's made it very clear that she believes that freer markets and the opportunity for greater competition, the opportunity to work with partners around the whole world, is indeed the way forward. And in her conversations that she's been having with other world leaders, she's been making that very clearly, that she wants to have stronger ties with countries around the whole world. It's, of course, a matter for each country to determine how they want to take their own politics and, indeed, policy forward. But globally, there needs to be the opportunity for people to have their say and for people to recognise, I think, that trade and liberalised markets is actually good for them, rather than necessarily focusing on what seems to be a simple argument, but is actually a false argument, that protecting markets and closing one's country from the outside world is the way forward. Clearly, history shows us it is not.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jayawardena, for taking time off your schedule and for coming on BizFirst in Focus, and for sharing, giving us some insight into your thinking and your hopes for the future of UK-Sri Lanka relations. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And that's our show for this evening. I'll see you again, same time, same place next week. Until then, good night and good luck.